First story. I wasn't looking for a new hobby. In fact, I was pretty set in my routine: work, Netflix, repeat. I'm the kind of person who likes a schedule, who likes knowing what's coming next. Spontaneity? Not my thing. Or at least, it wasn't. But that all changed one Saturday night at a dive bar near my apartment. I had been dragged there by my friend Sarah. She's the adventurous one in our group, always getting us into random activities like karaoke night or themed parties where you have to wear ridiculous costumes. This time, it was a local band gig. Support the local scene, she said. I wasn't sold on the idea, but I figured, hey, at least the drinks were cheap. The band came on stage, and I remember thinking they were fine. Nothing groundbreaking. They played covers of classic rock songs and threw in a few originals, which honestly sounded pretty much the same as the covers. The crowd was small, mostly friends and family, maybe a few randoms like us. But the lead singer had this kind of awkward charm, and they clearly had fun playing together. That's what stood out to me. After the show, Sarah wanted to go talk to them. She's always up for a chat, while I prefer to hang back. But there we were, standing in front of the band, Sarah complimenting their set while I awkwardly nodded along. Then, out of nowhere, the drummer said, "Hey, we're trying to book more gigs, but none of us really know what we're doing. You guys wouldn't happen to know anyone who could help us, would you?" I don't know what possessed me, but I blurted out, I could help. I'd never managed a band. I had no idea how to book shows, negotiate pay, or promote events. But for some reason, in that moment, I thought, why not? Maybe it was the beer talking, but I felt this urge to just try something new. The band, whose name was the Dead End Kids, a bit too on the nose, I thought, looked at me like I was their savior. "Really? You do that for us?" they asked, genuinely excited. And just like that, I became the unofficial manager of a band. The first few weeks were a blur. I Googled everything: how to write press releases, how to contact venues, how to promote on social media. I made a few embarrassing mistakes along the way. Like the time I accidentally emailed the wrong venue, trying to book them for a gig that was already taken by a much bigger, more popular band. Or the time I confused the set list order and had them play their slowest song as the opener, killing the energy of the room before the show even started. But gradually, I got the hang of it. I managed to land them a few gigs at slightly bigger venues. Nothing huge, but enough to get some local attention. I started making flyers, running their social media pages, even getting them an interview with a small indie music blog. It was actually fun in a way I hadn't expected. One of the most memorable gigs I booked for them was at a small outdoor festival. It wasn't Coachella, but for us, it felt like a big deal. There was a real stage, sound equipment that didn't constantly buzz, and even a backstage area where the band could hang out before their set. That day was chaos. The weather was unpredictable, and halfway through the day, it started raining. Not just a drizzle, but a full-on downpour. I panicked, thinking the whole thing was ruined. But the band didn't seem to care. They huddled under a tent with their instruments, joking around and tuning up as if the rain didn't bother them at all. The crowd, too, stuck around, huddling under umbrellas and ponchos. When it was finally their turn to play, the rain miraculously stopped. The stage was soaked, but the band went out there anyway. They played their hearts out, and for the first time, I saw them not just as a bunch of friends messing around with instruments, but as musicians who genuinely loved what they were doing. The crowd, still drenched, cheered louder than I'd ever heard. That gig was a turning point for me. I realized that all the chaos, the stress, the uncertainty, it was part of the excitement. Managing the band forced me to be flexible, to roll with the punches in a way I never had before. And I started to see the appeal of it. I never became a professional band manager. After a year or so, the band eventually drifted apart as people moved on to different jobs, different cities, different lives. But that year I spent with the Dead End Kids was one of the most unexpectedly rewarding experiences I've ever had. It wasn't about the music, really. It was about stepping outside of my comfort zone and trying something I never would have considered. It was about finding joy in the unpredictability of life, about realizing that sometimes the best things happen when you let go of the plan and just go with the flow. So yeah, I never expected to become the manager of a local band. But looking back, I wouldn't trade those chaotic, rain-soaked nights for anything. Second story. I was never a dog person. Cats? Sure, I could get behind them, independent, low maintenance, and they don't really care if you're home or not. But dogs always seemed like a lot of work. They needed constant attention, and frankly, I didn't think I had the time or the patience for it. My life was a balancing act of long work hours, occasional meetups with friends, and a little me time sprinkled in between. The idea of being tied down by a pet was the last thing on my mind. So when I found a scruffer-looking stray dog following me home one late evening, I didn't think much of it. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and I was used to seeing stray animals wandering around from time to time. This particular dog was small, maybe a mix of some terrier and who knows what, with fur matted from dirt and a limp that made it look like it had seen better days. It stayed a few paces behind me, keeping its distance but clearly following my trail. I figured it would lose interest once I got closer to home. I mean, I wasn't offering it food or anything. I wasn't even making eye contact. But as I turned the corner onto my street, there it was, still behind me, its soft brown eyes glued to me as if I was its last hope. I stood in front of my apartment building and glanced back at the dog. There was this moment where we just stared at each other. Part of me was tempted to go inside, shut the door, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something about the way it looked at me made me pause. I wasn't heartless, after all. "All right, buddy," I muttered. "But just for tonight." I let it follow me up to my apartment. Inside, I gave it some water and a piece of leftover chicken from the fridge. It devoured the food like it hadn't eaten in days. I made a mental note to call animal control the next day, but for the moment, I figured I'd let it rest. The dog curled up in a corner near the couch and, to my surprise, didn't make a sound all night. The next morning, I was still determined to follow through on my plan. I called animal control, but they told me it could take a few days before they could come by. Great, I thought. Now I was stuck with this dog for the foreseeable future. I went to work, leaving the dog with some food and water, hoping it wouldn't destroy my apartment while I was gone. When I came back later that evening, the place was intact. No chewed-up furniture, no mess on the floor. The dog greeted me with a wagging tail, its limp still noticeable, but not as severe as the night before. It almost seemed grateful. Over the next few days, I started getting used to having the dog around. I'd walk it in the mornings before work, and again when I got home. At first, I was annoyed by the extra responsibility, but slowly, I found the routine comforting. It gave my day a little more structure, something to look forward to when I came back from my job at the office, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly thrilling. One evening, after about a week of this, I realized I hadn't heard back from animal control. I knew I should follow up, but the thought of the dog being taken to a shelter made me uncomfortable. It wasn't like I had suddenly become a dog lover, but something had shifted. The dog, who I had started calling Milo, had become part of my routine. It was like this unspoken companionship had formed between us. One night, I took Milo out for his usual evening walk. It was dark, and the streets were quieter than usual. As we passed a park a few blocks away, a man approached us out of nowhere. At first, I didn't think much of it, maybe he was just another guy out for a late walk like me. But something about the way he moved made me uneasy. He kept glancing at me, then at Milo, like he was sizing us up. Suddenly, he lunged forward, trying to grab my bag. I didn't even have time to react before Milo went ballistic. He started barking, baring his teeth, and growling like I'd never heard before. The man stumbled back, clearly not expecting such a reaction from a small dog. Milo didn't stop barking until the guy turned and ran off into the night. My heart was pounding, but I realized I hadn't let go of my bag. I looked down at Milo, still growling but standing protectively by my side. It hit me then, this little dog had just defended me. He had no reason to. I wasn't his owner, I was just some guy who gave him food and shelter for a few days. But in that moment, I realized I couldn't let him go. The next morning, I cancelled my follow-up call with animal control. I took Milo to the vet instead, got him checked out, and had his limp looked at. Turned out, it was just a minor injury that would heal over time. They couldn't find a chip or any sign of previous ownership, which only made my decision easier. Over the next few months, Milo became my constant companion. I started waking up earlier to take him for longer walks. I even rearranged my work schedule so I could come home during lunch to check on him. Friends started noticing the change in me, how I seemed more relaxed, more grounded. Having Milo around made me more aware of how much I needed something to care for, something that depended on me. I had always been so focused on my career, my independence, that I hadn't realized how lonely my life had become. Milo forced me to slow down, to think about someone other than myself, and in a strange way, he made me feel more connected to the world around me. It's been almost a year since that night, and I can't imagine life without him. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who says, a dog changed my life, but here I am. Milo gave me more than just companionship, he gave me a sense of responsibility I didn't know I was missing. Funny how a stray dog following you home can change everything you thought you knew about yourself. Third story. It was supposed to be a simple weekend road trip. Just me, my best friend Mike, and a few open roads. We had planned this trip for weeks, 2 days away from the city, driving up to a small lakeside town we'd found on Google. The kind of place where the biggest attraction was a diner famous for its pies. No agenda, no stress, just a couple of guys trying to unwind from work and the daily grind. The plan was solid, at least on paper. We rented a car, packed some snacks, charged our phones, and hit the road early on Saturday morning. The drive was amazing at first, open highways, the sun shining, and a killer playlist we had curated just for the trip. It felt like the perfect escape. About halfway through, though, things started to go wrong. We were driving through a more rural part of the state, miles away from the main highway, when we noticed the fuel gauge creeping toward empty. No big deal, we thought, there'd be a gas station soon, right? After all, we had passed one about an hour back, so there had to be another one up ahead. But as the miles stretched on and no gas station appeared, we started getting nervous. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but of course, we had no service. The endless trees and farmlands that had seemed picturesque an hour ago now felt isolating. Mike, always the optimist, joked that this was how every horror movie starts. I laughed, but the anxiety was real. Eventually, we had to admit defeat. We were out of gas in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no clue where the nearest town might be. Mike suggested we wait it out, thinking another car would pass by and give us a lift to a gas station. But after an hour of sitting on the side of the road, with no cars in sight, we realized we had to take action. So we started walking. At first, we stayed on the road, figuring it would lead us somewhere eventually. But the road just seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding through dense woods with no sign of civilization. It wasn't long before the sun started to set, and we were still nowhere close to finding a gas station or anything resembling help. Mike and I had been friends since college, but the tension was starting to build. It's funny how a situation like this can bring out sides of people you don't normally see. Mike, who was usually laid back and go with the flow, started getting frustrated, while I, who tend to overplan everything, was trying not to freak out about how we'd screwed up so badly. By the time it got dark, we were both exhausted, and still no sign of a town or gas station. We found a spot near the road to sit and rest for a while. I was starting to wonder if we'd have to sleep outside, something I had absolutely no experience with. I wasn't exactly a camping kind of guy. As we sat there in the quiet darkness, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves, I found myself thinking about more than just our immediate predicament. I had been running through life in autopilot for months, focused on work, saving money, and planning for the future. But sitting there, with nothing to do but wait, I realized how little time I actually spent living in the present. This trip was supposed to be a break from the routine, but instead, it had become this crazy detour, forcing me to confront the fact that I'd been too wrapped up in the what-ifs of life. After what felt like hours, we saw headlights in the distance. A small pickup truck pulled up, and the driver, an older guy who looked like he'd been working the land all his life, asked if we needed help. Turns out, we weren't far from a small town, maybe a 20-minute drive. He gave us a lift to a gas station and even helped us get a can of gas to bring back to the car. Mike and I didn't talk much during the ride, too tired and relieved to do anything but say thank you. When we finally got back to the car, filled it up, and were back on the road, the whole ordeal seemed almost surreal, like a fever dream we'd wake up from at any moment. By the time we reached our original destination, it was too late to enjoy much of the weekend. We grabbed a quick meal at the diner, which, by the way, did live up to the hype, and then headed back home the next day. Looking back, the weekend didn't go at all as planned. We spent more time stranded in the middle of nowhere than relaxing by the lake. But something about that experience stuck with me. It forced me to let go of the need for control and to just deal with the present, even if that present involved wandering through the woods in the middle of the night with my best friend. In a weird way, it was exactly the break I needed, just not in the way I expected. We never did go back to that lakeside town, but every time I think about that weekend, I laugh. It's one of those stories that reminds me that sometimes the best memories come from the things you don't plan, from the moments when everything goes wrong but you somehow find a way to make it through. And honestly, I'm glad I learned that lesson with Mike by my side, because if there's anyone I'd want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere with, it's him.